So we're here to talk about politics beyond the two-party system. I remember back in 2015, I'd gone to give a lecture in Rome, and a mate of mine who I met for dinner that evening had just been in Parliament giving evidence about the new Renzi law, which is meant to give a chunk of votes to the party that gets a majority. And he turned up at dinner beaming with satisfaction, and I asked him how the session went. He said, very well. And I said, what's this law for? And he looked at me and he said, we want this law because we don't want Italian politics to be the fragmented multi-party mess that British politics is. In 2015, we were talking about the end of the two-party system and how things change within a couple of years in 2017. So what we want to talk about a bit today is where the other parties are, where they stand, what their prospects are. And I'm delighted to welcome, to do this, to my right, Professor Sarah Hobolt, who's Sutherland Chair in European Institutions at the LSE. To her right, we have Kirsty Blackman, an SNP MP. To her right, geographically, not politically necessarily, is Natalie Bennett, Baroness Bennett, former leader of the Green Party. And to my left, my far left, we have Richard Tice, who's leader of Reform UK. And on my immediate left, we have our very own Alan Wager. Alan is here in his capacity as an academic, but to respond to the question that was posed earlier, we didn't manage to get a positive response from the Liberal Democrats. We did try, so he's going to focus his remarks a little bit initially on the Lib Dems, but then he's free to rove as widely as he would like. So I'm going to ask Sarah to kick us off with a sort of overview of what we call challenger parties and their prospects.
Thank you, Annan. And of course, this panel is called Beyond the Two-Party System. And I think perhaps I wanted to start off by asking a slightly different question, which is why Brexit didn't bring us beyond the two-party system. Because if we look at the Parliament today, it's very much dominated by two parties. Of course, certainly if we look at English politics. And this is surprising in some ways because Brexit was the big moment, particularly, of course, for the Liberal Democrats, but also for other parties, the big moment that could have potentially taken us beyond two-party politics. And we saw a glimpse of that in the 2019 European Parliament elections that were touched upon in a previous panel, where the two major parties won just 23% of the vote. You had the Brexit parties, of course, ahead, followed by the Liberal Democrats, and you had the Conservatives, I think, in fifth place. So we had this sort of the glorious multi-party, or not so glorious, depending on whether you think it's a good thing, that we know from continental Europe. Yet what happened if we look forward to 2019, the general election, just a short half a year later, is that 87% of the seats in Parliament is controlled by the two major parties. This was the Get Brexit Done election where we had a deeply divided population and also two major parties that were also internally divided on the issue. So why was it that somehow this did not help the smaller parties in the way it could have? The SNP situation is different, of course, because the support is so geographically concentrated. The reason why this could have mattered was that Brexit was this wedge issue, as we like to call it as social scientists, wedge issue that split parties down the middle, not quite down the middle, but there was a very big chunk of Labour leavers, a very big chunk of Conservative Remainers, and people felt very deeply about it. People today still feel very deeply about being Remainers and Leavers. Our studies have showed that about 2/3 of people still identify that way, and back in 2019, people felt more strongly about that than being Conservative and Labour. So this was, in a sense, a moment where we could see a kind of realignment away from the dominance of Labour and Conservatives. And we've seen across Europe, we've really seen that the European issue is one that can shift and realign politics in that way. Now, so the key reason, of course, that this didn't happen in the UK is because of the electoral system. So the electoral system still benefits the two major parties, not only mechanically in the way that it translates votes into seats, but also psychologically. And I noticed in the last panel, a lot was focused on voters. Do they understand, how not to waste their vote and so on, but also for the parties themselves. So first of all, psychologically for voters, of course, you might think, I really feel like a Green Party voter and that's where my heart lies. But would you go and vote vote for the Green Party in most constituencies, bar, a very few, it's a wasted vote. It's going to be purely expressive, and therefore you don't vote for the Greens. You maybe vote for Labour or Lib Dems or whoever you feel is closest to you ideologically. But on top of that, we also see it affects how parties act, because if we think back in the last 5-6 years of British politics, look first with Labour under Corbyn, I think if we'd had proportional representation, that party would have split up. It did split up. We've maybe forgotten about the tickers or Change UK or what they were called, but it is such a massive risk for any ambitious politician to say, no, we're going to split up. And similar with the Conservatives, the civil war they had over Brexit that turned them from a Remain supporting party, split, but Remain supporting, into the Brexit party in a sense in terms of the position they take under Boris Johnson. But it just doesn't make sense to split up. So you have these enormous force of the institutions that keep the two parties dominant. So that just made it very difficult. Again, SNP, it's different under first past the post. Even if you're a smaller party, if your electoral support is very geographically low, concentrated, you can still do very well, as we know, of course, that the SNP has done and is continued to do. But for other parties, Reform UK, of course, well, the Brexit party, and then Reform UK was particularly squeezed by this move where basically Boris Johnson came in, took the Brexit party position, and now that left a Reform UK with sort of little room to maneuver. On the Remain side, you could say, well, they sort of, particularly I think the Liberal Democrats, this was their big chance, and they didn't manage to capitalize on it. I mean, we might hear more about that, but they really didn't. Now, today, of course, we have Brexit being less salient, but it still matters. And I think a lot have been talked in the previous panel about a progressive alliance. So one thing I just want to end on, it's not all about what happens before the election. Where this can perhaps be an important moment is also what happens after the next general election. We could well be in a situation where there's not a clear majority by either of the major parties, and there perhaps this realignment in British politics to a degree where still parties on the Remain side have, if not have any kind of formal pact, have a sort of informal understanding that will make it easier for cooperation on that side of politics. That's yet to be, that's all up to the parties themselves, of course, but certainly what we've seen in what we see now in the public is we have the Leavers, being represented, but the Remainers by the major parties, they don't have it. We hear Labour talking all about the cost of living crisis, but Brexit is something that Labour doesn't really want to touch for good reasons, perhaps, but also something that's not represented really, that the smaller parties have not been able to win on. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There's a lot of questions coming in that sort of nibble around the edges of both why aren't we doing more on devolution and about electoral reform. Just to reassure you, at the end of March, at our next event, we're going to be talking a lot about the electoral system, devolution and so on and so forth. I mean, today, the focus is very much on the politics. Speaking of which, Kirsty, I mean, as Sarah said, the position of the SNP is different, and of course you are a governing party. But in terms of the legacy of Brexit, it strikes me there's a little bit of a double-edged sword here for the SNP, which is on the one hand, there was a sort of palpable increase in fervour around independence because of Brexit and the way it was handled. On the other hand, there seem to be elements to which you are losing levers and that the Scottish politics is crystallising now into two blocks. I mean, one is yes, remain, the other is no, leave. Does that pose you a problem when you think not just about electoral politics, but about the referendum that you want to have?
I mean, I think, from reading the report, yeah, there's a coalescing, but it's not so much around yes, remain and no leave. It's around yes, remain and other stuff. So it's either you're in the yes, remain camp or you're not. You're in some sort of other camp. So that there are, people that feel very passionately that we should remain part of the United Kingdom, that also feel that we should remain part of the European Union. That hasn't gone away to the extent that those people who support independence and want to leave the EU, that number has reduced significantly. The number of people identifying as being in that camp has significantly reduced. I mean, I was thinking about the kind of current political environment and where we are in the current political environment, and Brexit is one of the things that is there, and what is happening post Brexit and how we tackle things post Brexit. But I mean, for us also, you have to remember that the Scottish electorate is further left than the electorate in England in the main. And therefore, you know, if you think about this in cold, hard political terms, the fact that we've got a Tory government who are pursuing Brexit, who are anti-immigration, who are, you know, far more right than the majority of the Scottish people, you've got Partygate, you've got all of those things happening. Actually, you know, there's a real opportunity for the SNP in that, and you know, it's a terrible opportunity because we're seeing the negatives for our population of the impact of those policies. But electorally, you know, there's a significant positive from that. If you don't mind, can I just touch on a couple of other things? So you mentioned the electoral systems, and I just wanted to kind of touch on the electoral systems. Obviously, in Parliament in Westminster, we've got, you know, because it's first past the post, there is a domination there, and the SNP dominates in Scotland. You know, we win the vast majority of seats, and we have done in every election since 2015. We have two other electoral systems in Scotland. We've got the STV system that we use for the council elections, and we've got the additional members list system that we use for the Scottish Parliament elections. The Scottish Parliament election system means that it's very, very difficult to get a majority, but the SNP continues to get as close to a majority as you reasonably can within that system. Mm-hmm. And given that we've got the cooperation agreement with the Greens there, we've got this majority here. We've also got, in terms of looking at elections, we've got the council elections coming this year. Again, different system in Scotland. We've got the STV system. We've also got a system where all of our unitary authorities, and every council in Scotland is a unitary authority, has an election this year. It's not the case where there's a 1/3 of councils elected. So this is a massive year for council elections. And for us, the last council elections were in 2017, where if you look at our Westminster results, we were doing less well than we have done in some of the other years. We still, you know, swipe the board in the majority of the Westminster seats. But, you know, we were dipped in terms of the polling, in terms of the support that we currently have. Mm-hmm. So I'd expect to see SNP gains in the council election this year as well. So I think there's a lot of positive opportunities for the SNP, some of them around Brexit and the impacts of Brexit that we'll continue to see coming through, but a significant chunk of them around actually the actions of the Conservative government and the fact that that does not sit well with the majority of our population.
I'm tempted to push you on whether or not, therefore, you'd like to see another Conservative government after the next election.
No.
But anyway, we'll move on. Nat, I mean, Sarah sort of laid down a bit of a gauntlet to you, which is, you know, however much you might like the Greens, ultimately, why would you vote for them given the first-past-the-post system? Because ultimately, they're not going to win in your seat. I mean, you must hear this an awful lot.
Well, I think, first of all, it's worth noting that, perhaps unsurprisingly, given where we're sitting, that this was a very Westminster-centric view. Mm-hmm. Politics is just not about Westminster. Politics, of course, is about the nations other than England, but it's also about local councils. And you talked about going back to a two-party state after 2016. But if you look at our results from the last two council elections, if you look at what the graph looks like, you know, we've been for decades just very, very, very slightly growing our number of councillors. The graph, literally, I'm not exaggerating, looks like that. The last two council elections, we've had enormous increases in our number of councillors. So if you look around the country, not only are we now again running Brighton and Hove as a minority administration, but we're also in 13 councils around the country in some form of rainbow administration. Interesting case study is Herefordshire, the kind of place that traditionally used to be thought so true blue that you'd hardly even bother to have a vote. And it's now in a rainbow administration with the green in the environment and a list of other things portfolio. So what we're seeing is Greens winning an enormous number of seats under first past the post, because there's still first past the post elections in local councils in England, and we're advancing at great speed. Now that is not visible because, you know, one of the other great problems in British politics is the immense concentration of power and resources here in Westminster, and the lack of resources in local councils, and the fact that everyone focuses on what happened in PMQs and who told the best bad jokes semi-well, and that's regarded as British political coverage. But there's all sorts of things happening out there on the ground that comes out of the 2015 election and the growth and the place that we took there. I do just also want to pick up what you said, Anne, about talking about, you know, we don't want a fragmented multi-party mess and seeing the end of the two-party system. Well, when I look across the chamber in the House of Lords, I see a fragmented mess.
Right, yeah.
The Conservative Party is hugely divided amongst itself. Any serious issue, when I put down even a radical amendment on something like trying to stop the financial sector milking money, taking 16% of the money paid to every care bed, going off into hedge funds, I'll find a Conservative to support me in that. Nationality and Borders Bill. There's lots of Conservatives who are horrified by what the government's doing with the Nationality and Borders Bill, and they're speaking out. So the Conservative Party, and I would say probably obviously to the Labor Party, are incredibly divided, fragmented messes. And just because they've been the two largest parties for a century doesn't mean that's going to continue. I very much doubt they've ever been more unstable than they are now. And the third thing is I wanted to say, picking up particularly on the Brexit and the post-Brexit issue, there's a lot of young people who are profoundly angry about Brexit and the impact that Brexit has had on their lives. And I mean, this was something we focused on in the referendum. Young people now have far fewer freedoms and opportunities than their parents had. And they're seeing that. And, COVID has kind of frozen things for 2 years. And if we think about something I was doing in the House yesterday, a little oral question on the impact on the music industry and the cultural sector of Brexit. Now, you may not know Tankus the Henge. I confess I didn't know it. It's a band. They did a 15-day tour of France. They managed to squeeze in last sort of the middle end of last year. And they had to cost them £4,000 more directly just because of some of the issues around Brexit that arise for our cultural sector. Now, what we're seeing is a lot of young people. I see the climate strikers, under 18s even. And, votes at 16 is another issue that we really need to focus on, and we've already got in much of the country. Young people, as the freeze of COVID stops, they're going to look around and say, what kind of world have we landed in? And why have you, looking across the road there, landed us in it? So there's going to be, there is already a generational split, and there's going to be much more of a generational split in British politics.
Okay. Natalie, you've given me a nice segue to Richard, which is not something I imagine you hear all the time. But so, I mean, absent Brexit, what is there for you to sort of campaign on centre? What I'd love you to tell me, Richard, is that actually your party really misses European Parliament elections. Because for a party like yours, actually, if you don't have European party elections, how do you break through?
Well, I think the point is that what we miss is a proportional representation system. And I think what's really interesting about what Kirsty was just saying is that if you're a popular party, I mean, the big criticism about PR is that you can't have strong, effective government. But actually, the SNP, they proved that that's not the case, because under first past the post, they do well in Scotland. And yet under PR, with the additional member system, they do well in the Holyrood elections. So actually, if you've got policies that your electorate want, then you will do well. And I think, in fairness, that's what the SNP achieve. I think the reality is that how long will this country want to live under a national government that essentially means we're in a one-party state? And I think, for me, knocking on doors, and there have been a variety of by-elections recently, almost nobody's talking about Brexit. People are talking about what others have referred to, the cost of living crisis, the cost of energy, how people are going to make ends meet. That's what's really exercising people. And I think those will be the big issues around the next election. But as the previous panel was touching on, look, the reality is that at some point, the people are going to say, we don't want a one-party state, and never underestimate the common sense of British voters. And at some point, I think some form of system will come in. It was interesting, the discussion earlier about whether or not PR could be introduced with or without a referendum, and whether or not if the Liberals and Labour came to some form of arrangement, whether they could introduce it through the House of Commons without a referendum. And I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that actually, I think attitudes are changing, and changing quite fast. The saddest thing for me is when you hear on the doors, and I love campaigning because you learn so much, but when you hear on the doors, I'm done with all of you, I'm never voting again, it never makes any difference. And for me, that's the biggest thing about PR, is that every vote matters, every vote counts. And you can genuinely then say to someone, look, it really does matter. Whereas if you're in a safe Tory seat and you're a Labour voter or any other party, you sort of feel, well, my vote doesn't matter, so I'm not going to bother. And so turnout collapses. And that's really sad for democracy. And the joy about having more parties is that the real winner actually, it's not necessarily the smaller parties who battle hard and work incredibly hard and may end up thinking, okay, we didn't get the seats we wanted. The real winner is democracy. Because actually, with more debate, more discussion, more options, voters actually have a broader range of options to look at. And under PR, I think people feel my vote matters more. This time, I'm going to lend it, because you're always lending a vote. I'm going to lend it to that party for this reason. And for me, that's why I think it's, I don't know when, but I think at some point it's inevitable.
Okay, but I'm not quite going to let you get away with that, in the sense that I take the point about electoral reform, but in the here and now, how do you or your party manage to get noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll come back to the point. I think the next election will be fought around energy, the cost of energy, which drives the cost of living, and everything around that. I think will be, if not, I think it will be the central issue at the next election. That and healthcare will be, depending on what happens with healthcare over the next couple of years. I think those will be the two big issues, and in a sense, the SNP's success is because it's founded around a single issue. And for us, we think that the single issue will be the cost of energy, the energy decisions that we're making, the energy policies around net zero, around shale gas. These things will be potentially central to the next election and central to the issues that we think people want to debate on.
But again, why would they turn to? I mean, there's a structural problem you face, isn't there, which is low recognition.
Correct, yeah. Look, I mean, launching a new brand in any walk of life, any industry, any academic institution, launching a new brand is hard. No one disputes that, and essentially Reform UK is a new brand. The crossover recognition between the Brexit Party and Reform UK is pretty low. And launching a new brand in politics with a two-party system is even harder. But I remake the point. If you want to shape an influence, look, if you want to win the lottery, you've got to buy a ticket. I don't buy a ticket, I don't expect to win it. If you want to shape an influence, you've got to be on the ballot paper, and you've got to be on the ballot paper everywhere in a general election. And that's what we will be. And I think that will encourage debate around the key issues. And we will have a very different position on energy policies to the current mainstream within Westminster. And I think that actually will be very instructive to the next election.
Brilliant, thank you. Do keep putting I have got your questions here. I am going to turn to them, but do keep voting for the ones you want me to ask. Alan, Sarah suggested that the sort of, correct me if I get you wrong, that the Lib Dems sort of blew their big chance in 2019. It's a Brexit election, and they're a party that's committed to remain. What went wrong, and is it fixable in the future?
Well, I mean, it's hard not to agree that they blew their chance, because if you think about the sort of the summer and autumn of 2019, or let's talk about the electoral system making it impossible for smaller parties to break through, that Richard's party were first or second in the polls, and the Liberal Democrats were first or second in the polls. So at that one time, it looks like it was possible that there could be a sort of a breaking of the mold within the two-party system, and that was ultimately not possible because of the electoral system. But when you heard the phrase leaving the Tories quaking in their boots and Ed Davey's Lib Dems last week, you heard that Andrew Marr say that in the New Statesman. That wouldn't necessarily have been something you'd have heard said a few years ago, and that's because he was talking about this idea of a sort of electoral pact that's been discussed today. And the fact that that's sort of on the cards, if you like, is one of a few sort of indications that maybe things are potentially looking up for the Lib Dems. So in the 2019 election, they only got basically the same amount of votes, the same amount of seats that they got in 2015 and 2017 and 2019. So that was a bit of a disaster, and it's the sort of level that the Liberal Party got throughout most of the 20th century. So there has been the sense that the Lib Dems were maybe stuck in a rut. And when you hear talk about dozens of potential seats that are potentially available for the Liberal Democrats, and it's given credence by sort of sources within the Labour Party, that's got to sound pretty good for the Liberal Democrats. You look at the leadership rating for Fred Davey, for example, as many people say, he's doing a good job as doing a bad job, but about half of people say don't know when they ask that question. That was the sort of same level that you saw for sort of Paddy Ashdown in 1989, the late 80s, when the Liberal Democrats were essentially first formed, which speaks to sort of all the problems that Richard Tice identifies here, actually, in terms of starting a new brand, starting a new, sort of turning a new page as a party. That was sort of level that that Paddy Ashdown was polling at, and he ultimately managed to sort of increase the prospects of the Lib Dems, in part by this abandonment of equidistance that we're seeing at the moment. Ed Davey sort of try and pursue, and you can actually make the case that for Ed Davey, he's had potentially the best 2021 of any major party leader in the UK. You know, you can really make that case. You look back at the sort of Cheshire-Amersham by-election, no major broadcaster, TV or radio, even bothered to turn up at the count, and they ended up sort of winning. And even in North Shropshire, if you think about how likely that was seen to be a sort of a game for the Lib Dems, you know, even the sort of most optimistic Lib Dem didn't necessarily think that was gonna happen. So, I mean, there are two different sort of key takeaways people are taking from this. The first is this thing that everyone's discussing today, this idea of a progressive alliance and increased tactical voting. I think there are some really key reasons why that might happen in terms of the type of voters that the Liberal Democrats could target, sort of graduate, Remainers, as they were called during the Brexit divide, and potentially, you know, if those labels sort of fade, that's still a label that sort of identifies a type of voter that Liberal Democrats can target. And also sort of places. With Tim, who just spoke, we identified the sort of yellow halo of support for the Lib Dems in and around London where they can target. So there's a very clear geographical element to their support. But the other thing that people maybe were saying after North Shropshire is that maybe the Lib Dems could become a sort of catch-all party, including getting the support of some disgruntled Leave supporters, and then maybe in areas like the southwest they could sort of have a resurgence. I mean, but I think there's plenty of reasons to be a bit sceptical of that. If you look back at the sort of May local elections, which seemed ages ago, you know, in Cornwall, the Lib Dems, that used to be one of their sort of key in the 2010 election. Every single MP in Cornwall was a Lib Dem, and they only got 19% back in May. So unless something big has changed in terms of the Leave vote, which is potentially what's happened, I think the Lib Dems need to be a bit circumspect about thinking that they can potentially be this sort of catch-all party that they once were. So it's a potentially optimistic picture for the Lib Dems, but it depends on whether or not they are clever enough to sort of work out where they can and can't succeed. And one of the problems for the Lib Dems in years gone by, in elections gone by, I think 2019 and 2010, is that they sort of potentially overstretched as a political party, and there are signs in all this talk of a pact that maybe they're sort of boxing wise, if you like.
Well, if you don't get a retweet from a party leader for that, then you never will get one, I have to say. I mean, one of the paradoxes in the report, in the section on the Lib Dems, is, if I remember it rightly, it says actually what the Lib Dems need Brexit to go away. They need to move on from Brexit and look at other things, which is partly because their electoral base is quite divided. But for all your parties, do you want to be talking about Brexit at all at the next election? I mean, Labour seems to have made a decision pretty much not to. Where does the balance of opportunities lie for you in terms of, and I know your position is very, very different on this, Kirsty, but in fact, you might as well go first and we'll do your unique position first. But for the others, I mean, Richard, for the Lib Dems, Alan, or for the Greens, Natalie, after Kirsty, do you want to be talking about this still, or do you want to move on to other things?
I'll just briefly touch on what Alan said about the most successful 2021. Nicola Sturgeon had the most successful 2021 of all of them.
Yeah.
And this is one of the issues that we have, is that, you know, people in UK politics talk about the Lib Dems as you know, still feel like the Lib Dems are the third party, despite the fact that the SNP are the third party, because we're considered by a lot of people in the mainstream, unfortunately, some sort of fringe concern, when actually, you know, we're the third party in the UK Parliament, and still we've got a lot of mainstream media platforming the Lib Dems ahead of us, which is not how it should be. And just one more thing to add on what was said there. Actually, Richard, in terms of the electoral success, you know, actually what Natalie said about winning council elections is the way to get to places, because if you've got council representatives, and this is how we've been successful, it's not by having one issue, it's by doing well when we are elected. We are elected, you know, in Scottish Parliament. We're a good government in the Scottish Parliament. We continue to get elected on that basis because we do well once we are elected, and that's why you need to concentrate on councils. As well as devolved administrations. I absolutely want to talk about Brexit. I absolutely want to be talking about everything that we have lost. You know, I'm on the DEFRA Select Committee, which was a bit of a surprise to me, but it's been very interesting. And you know, we're talking to fishermen who are saying, hold on a second, we voted for this, we wanted this to happen, and now it's not what was promised. This is not what was sold to us. So, you know, there are still lots and lots of repercussions of Brexit that we want to be talking about, not just in terms of the nuts and bolts still need to be sorted out, but, you know, that needs to continue to happen. But in terms of thinking about the Scottish independence referendum that is upcoming, we're absolutely going to be pitching that we want to be Scotland within the EU. That is our position, that's our pitch, and that is where a significant proportion of the Scottish population feel like they want to be. So it's an electoral winner for us, as well as the right thing to do, and, you know, very much accords with our core values.
Natalie.
Well, I think I want to also start with something that Alan said about the Lib Dem problem. And I was flashing back to, I think it was Nick Clegg who said, we're going to be in the middle, wherever the middle is. What do you stand for? What sort of society are you aiming for? And we have a economic, social, environmental, political, educational state of crisis, a geopolitical crisis. That's the status quo, the way we've been doing things has got us to that point. And this is something that young people are acutely aware of. So the point is, the question now is very clearly what happens next. And there's a survey that's been done over many years, a graph that shows that asking people, do you think your kids and grandkids will have a better life than you've had? And that's increasingly massively negative. People get that the current system is broken. And, you know, I would say in some ways we're the direct polar political opposite of the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems want to be in the middle, just, you know, keeping things going as they are. We want an entirely new system. We understand that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and that means that you have to have everyone having enough. There's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life if we just share them out fairly. And that's an utter transformation of all of our current systems. It's things like universal basic income, 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. It's an entire transformation of our energy system. I'm going to agree with Richard that we need a transformation of our energy system, just in the absolute opposite direction. And indeed, I also would agree with him that healthcare is a great issue, but we obviously need to protect our NHS, deprivatise our NHS. But we have to absolutely focus, and COVID is focused on this very, very clearly, that we are a profoundly unhealthy society. And that's got nothing to do with the NHS. That's insecurity, poverty, mental ill health, young people not being able to see a future ahead of them with the climate emergency and the nature crisis. You know, we are at a point of profound crisis, and staying in the middle and triangulating just is not going to happen anymore. And I would say that there is, you know, that's the problems of the main parties. And this is a broader situation. We've had 40 years of neoliberalism. Before that, we had 40 years of a social democratic consensus. We're at a point now where we're going to decide what the next 40 years looks like. And I would say, you know, we say there's enough resources for a decent life if you share them out fairly. The far right, the other side, says it's a difficult, dangerous world and we've got to shove the others away, whoever those others are, build walls to keep them out. Let the plutocrats run riot because, you know, they know what to do, the man riding up on the white horse to the rescue. We say politics should be something that everybody does, not have done to them. And that's the absolute opposite of the world we have today. And that's what we're campaigning for.
Thank you. Before I come on to you, Richard, I just want to say, firstly, it's not Alan's job to defend the Lib Dems. So absolutely not what he's here to do. So you're excused if you've started to feel that this is where you're being put. But also, Sarah, I mean, if there's anything you hear that you want to chip in about, then just nudge me and chip in. If there's something so far.
No, I was just... Did you answer the question about... whether you wanted. I'm just curious
Yeah.
whether you want to talk about Brexit.
Well, I guess we don't frame it in terms of Brexit. We frame it in changing the whole system, and that means a basis of cooperating with everybody. So we want to, remove all those barriers that Brexit's put in. But that's not a case of going back to where we were. We don't want to go back to 2016. The people who said they wanted to take back control in 2016 were absolutely right. The problem wasn't Brussels. The problem is Westminster. And if we fix Westminster, then we can actually start to have a decent relationship with Europe again.
Which brings me to you, Richard, and a question from Simon Usherwood, which is if part of the thing about Brexit was it was a sort of cipher for all sorts of various dissatisfactions that people had with the system. Is there something else that you can mobilise in its place, or are you interested in keeping on talking about Brexit?
Definitely not, actually. And having knocked on thousands of doors in by-elections over the last few weeks and months, nobody on the doors, or ordinary people who think quite sensibly about politics for about a minute a week, they're not talking about Brexit, they're focusing on what I touched on earlier, which is the cost of living, it's decent schooling, and why can't they see a GP face to face? Those are the real issues that affect people every day, and that plague on all the houses. And again, actually, Natalie is right, that the system is broken to the point that the loss of confidence in everything, and I think that is getting people engaged with politics again and believing that they can make a difference is absolutely crucial.
But that's where they only think about politics 1 minute a week. Doesn't work. People need to be able to get together with their friends, their neighbours, their colleagues, and change things, and that's something that takes time.
It takes time, and it takes a different system, which is why PR is the system that I think will make the biggest transformation, because people in safe seats, the 2 seats that we've been campaigning in fact, the 3 seats, Bexley, North Shropshire and now Erdington, they're essentially safe seats. And so all of the other voters are essentially disenfranchised. And which is why that in these seats, you get the other main party doesn't bother. Labour didn't bother in Bexley and North Shropshire, which is why in North Shropshire the Lib Dems came through. Labour didn't bother in Chesham. And, is that really the politics we want? I don't think it is. I think we need people to be engaged. What was interesting about Chesham was that never underestimate, as I said before, the smart British voter will work out if there's an opportunity to change something, which is what they did in Chesham. The whole Labour vote went Lib Dem, en masse. And I think as we move forward, as more people feel the system is broken, the two-party system is not working for them and for the country, I think that will increase. I just don't know how long it'll take.
Okay, Alan, you're welcome to answer the sort of Lib Dem and Brexit question, but if there's anything else you want to chip in on, then just...
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about all the discussion about electoral reform and also the Brexit policy is if we think about what might happen after any general election that is with any Labour-led government, there'll have to be sort of negotiations with other parties, and you would imagine the 2 asks that the Liberal Democrats would come up with would be electoral reform and probably a single market and customs union membership, right? And it might be easier in that circumstance for the Labour Party to countenance giving electoral reform without a referendum if the alternative is, a policy that would involve the return of free movement. So these issues about Brexit and about electoral reform are potentially, intertwined in quite an interesting way, potentially, if you think about what might happen after the next election.
And talking about electoral pacts and so on, there's a question specifically for you, Kirsty, from that man Curtis again. If the next election produces a hung parliament, will the SNP insist on Indy Ref 2 as the price for supporting a minority government?
I can't see us going into any sort of formal agreement with well, we certainly wouldn't go into any formal agreement in any circumstance with the Conservatives. That just simply wouldn't happen. But in terms of thinking about any conversations that we have with the Labour Party or with some sort of Labour Lib Dem conglomerate, yeah, absolutely, Indeed F2, if it hasn't already happened by the next general election, will, I can't imagine us asking for any other price. That is the key one, is that we need to have the independence referendum so that we can be an independent country and do all of the things, particularly things that Natalie was talking about, do all of those things about reforming our energy system, about improving the cost of living, about rejoining the European Union, all of those things for the benefit of our population. as I said earlier, that our single issue is not the reason for our electoral success, but it does continue to be our most important priority. We want Scotland to be an independent country.
So that's an unambiguous yes, basically.
Pretty much, but remember, I'm not the party leader. So as a member of the SNP and an MP for the SNP, I think it's an unambiguous yes.
Okay,
but I'm
that's
not
a slightly ambiguous yes, but not very ambiguous. Okay. Just, I mean, we've got a question from Mark English about whether there is space for a rejoin party. And I mean, I can use this question partly on face value, whether, you know, opposition parties could sort of gather together under the umbrella of rejoin. But the broader question, I suppose, is the Progressive Alliance question, isn't it? Should there be, or could there be, more fruitful collaboration between opposition parties? Natalie?
Well, I mean, what I would say is I don't think personally there's any enormous future in a rigid fixed alliance that sits here in London in a non-smoke-filled room these days and goes, right, you allocate there, you allocate there, you allocate there. I profoundly believe in power remaining locally and only being referred upwards when absolutely necessary. That's the total opposite of that. And I think it produces, as we saw in some cases, a real backlash. People feel like they're not being given the choice, they're not being given the right what to do. But what we have seen is people are increasingly fed up with the current system. They're thinking, I'm not going to keep behaving the same way and getting the same results because I don't like those results. So people are becoming more and more detached from being, I'm a loyal Labour voter or I'm a loyal Conservative voter. And so I think, you know, what we've seen develop organically is the situation where parties, you know, stand a candidate but do virtually nothing else, and voters get the very clear signal about what the best thing to do is here. But I mean, it is worth saying this is a reminder of how, and I think we've got to focus on this, how complicated first past the post makes it for voters. They have to calculate how every other person in their constituency is going to vote and adjust their own vote accordingly. Whereas if you have PR, you vote for what you want and you get it. And in terms of how we get to there, I think I don't think we have to have another referendum. The word referendum, if you say, you know, talking about being on doorsteps, you just say the word referendum to people and then just go.
In Scotland.
Well, okay, right. Yeah, okay, sorry. Apologies. England, Wales, and I'd imagine Northern Ireland. But you know, I think Make Votes Matter. Great organisation, big event tomorrow, by the way, advertisement. You know, they had set up the Good Systems Agreement, which was an agreement to say we will back a PR system and we'll have a People's Constitutional Convention properly constituted to actually draw up the details of what that looks like. And this is profoundly empowering the people, taking a representative group of people. This is direct, deliberative democracy, deciding what our new constitution looks like. And if you have a majority of people elected on a Good Systems Agreement, then you have a whole pathway forward with absolutely impeccable democratic credentials, and you don't need a referendum for Westminster.
Well,
you need a referendum in other
it's
places.
Also worth saying that the Conservative Party plan on changing electoral systems back to first past the post in a whole load of different areas of England without a referendum locally or anything like that. So there is a precedent for changing the electoral system back to first past the post with that one. So why shouldn't the reverse be true, you could argue?
Yeah, which is precisely what Jen Williams has said on the Slido, actually. If you can change the rules for local government and police commissioners without a referendum, then what's the
Jen Williams agreeing that's a good idea.
Difference? Sarah, have you anything progressive alliance? Is that the sort of thing likely, desirable, feasible in our electoral system?
I mean, I think it looks like a sort of very formal pact is unlikely, but it's clear that there is a real, real issue in terms of, I mean, we saw it in the last general election that the vote, for example, the Remain vote was just very split, and it did mean that the kind of parties that might be in a progressive alliance didn't get the seats they would have otherwise got if there'd been more coordination. I don't think it was quite right what was said in the last panel, oh, it's easy for voters, they can just coordinate. I mean, as was just said, it's very, very complicated to know. Sometimes how you would coordinate for voters, and they don't necessarily pay the kind of attention. I have the sort of insights that even if they wanted to, they could. So I think that's just what happens. You don't have the sort of translation of votes into seats that you would have in a PR system. Now, one thing, a criticism of the PR system is, well, maybe it's easier at the time when you cast your vote, but do you know what you're getting? I mean, that would be the kind of first past the post case to be made. Do you know what you're getting in government? Because of course what happens is you do get a translation of your sort of true preferences, whatever votes into seats, but then you very rarely, and again, you know, Scotland is almost sort of an exception, although not quite, you very rarely get a single party majority, and even in Scotland, you don't have that now. So that means there is, you know, you have coalition formation, and we've seen that across Europe if you look at it comparative, and that's most likely what would happen in the UK. I think we're a long way away from it, but if we had PR, we would have coalitions. Now, some people like that. That means you have more sort of broader preferences, but it means in terms of accountability that right now, if you say, okay, I'm not very pleased with the government, it's pretty clear as a voter what you should probably do. You should probably not vote for the Conservative Party, and there's a kind of very clear accountability in that. And that goes away in most systems where you have PR. Yeah. So it's worth saying that, yeah, you get what you want, you know what you get when you're casting your vote, but you don't necessarily know what government.
But you don't, because, you know, the 2015 people voted for David Cameron and they ended up with Theresa May. You know, it's not necessarily that you get what you want, because actually, because of the fragmentation that was spoken about of the parties just now, if you vote Conservative, you don't actually know what you're going to be getting, because you don't necessarily follow their manifestos anyway.
Richard?
But I think also, you know, we want to be positive, and I think people want to vote for what they believe in, not what they're afraid of. And that's the whole, what Sarah's just been talking about, is actually you sort of end up under the first past the post system. It's more what you're afraid of, but it's much more positive to talk about what you believe in, what do you want, and then cast your vote and energise everybody to know their vote matters. That's the key thing. But, so, you know, and it's interesting, you touched on a question of, you know, linking around Rejoin. I mean, actually, Rejoin EU did stand in the last 3 by-elections. They're not standing in the current one. And there was no appetite for it, which in a sense highlights, look, they're a new brand. It's really hard. But it's interesting they haven't decided to stand in this one. I just think people are focusing on tomorrow's challenges, you know, not yesterday's issues. And I think that will move forwards as we move, whenever the next general election is, a couple of years away. I think the challenges then will be even harder than they are today.
And where do you stand on this question of sort of electoral alliances, formal or informal? I mean, does your desire for constitutional reform trump any policy differences you have with some of the other challenger parties? Is that the priority now? I mean,
look, we've got lots of priorities. But I mean, actually, you know, when you're knocking on people's doors, it's not their priority for electoral reform. I mean, that's the reality. The priority is how am I going to pay the bills next month? That's the reality, given where we're at with tax rises, with the cost of living, with energy price rises. That's the real issue. But I think electoral reform is a significant part of the way of improving the way this country is run and managed and governed.
Okay, I want to sort of challenge all of you on PR a bit, sort of building on what Sarah said, which is we've got a comment here, which is that PR might be a fairer system, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to have confidence in politics or politicians, partly for the reasons that Sarah said, that actually those lines of accountability are far less clear. It's a bit more muddied. It's a bit more uncertain. You end up with messy coalitions.
But I think the idea that you have accountability for one vote every 5 years is a nonsense. And, you know, Boris Johnson gets elected. What does Boris Johnson stand for? What does Boris Johnson stand for yesterday? What does he stand for today? What will he stand for tomorrow? What are you choosing if you choose Boris Johnson? Whereas, if you look at, well, say, the example, we've just had the German elections, and the Germans have formed a coalition. And, people like to say, oh, it took them weeks and weeks to form a coalition agreement. But that means people sit down in a room and thrash out, here's my manifesto, here's your manifesto, what can we agree on, what's our plan for the government? And there's a really important question, which, again, I'm going to agree with Richard, about the quality of governance in the UK. And I'm very influenced by an excellent little book by Professor Stein Ringen, Nation of Devils, who talks about how the quality of governance in PR systems is objectively much better than the quality of governance, because you actually have to sit down and agree, this is what this government is going to try to agree to achieve over our term of office. We set this down, it's in writing, it's public, it's available, you can be held to account to that. Whereas how do we make policy? I mean, I used to work for the Times many years ago. I saw policies being made. Minister has a bad morning on the Today programme. Minister thinks I need a good headline. Minister scribbles something on the back of an envelope. 9 o'clock that evening, Times splash, government is going to do something. That's no way to run a country.
Richard, do you want to come back on this question of PR and faith in why it should necessarily lead to increased faith in politics and politicians?
Because I think all politicians, when you're canvassing for a vote on the door, you can genuinely say every vote matters, and it really does. And yes, as Natalie said, you're going to end up with a few weeks of negotiations about the key things you can agree on. But a few weeks within the context of 5 years, frankly, is worth it in order to get some stable, better governance and better management. And I think for me, that's a real advantage.
Richard, in a way, you sound a bit like Nick Clegg in 2010 when he was sort of justifying when he thought the coalition would actually, just the act of doing it would make people realise, actually coalitions are a pretty good idea. And actually, the amount of support for coalitions went down. And this problem, the problem is that maybe just whatever happens, you get this sort of resistance, cultural really, more than about the things that Sarah talked about, the mechanical and the voting system and so on in the UK. That just
but the reality is, when you listen to people on the doors, confidence is collapsing and turnout is dropping, and that's bad for everybody. It really is. And so, and look, the reality is, I think the Lib Dems in 2010, they made a concession on student fees, and the voters never forgot. And that was a choice they made, and I think that was probably the biggest loss for them. That's democracy. If they'd made a different choice, and who knows?
Kirsty, do you want to chip in on this question?
Yeah. How can it be good to have a system where basically the majority decisions that affect the entirety of the UK are taken by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor? The first past the post system has meant that we've got this, power is very, very concentrated in a very small number of people who take those decisions. Whereas if you've got a PR system, you're much more likely to have much more collective responsibility because you'll have more than one party, so you'll have, different sets of policies coming together to try and make the best sets of decisions. And it will step away from being just those two people. If we're talking about the COVID testing decisions that's being taken because the Chancellor doesn't want to spend that money anymore. It's not being taken because the Department of Health, or that's my reading of it, because the Department of Health thinks it's the right thing to do, or because the Prime Minister even thinks it's the right thing to do. It's just those very small number of people that are taking those decisions. So quality of government is probably not the right way to phrase it. A government that can get every vote through, yes, that's what first past the post gives you. It doesn't necessarily give you a better government or even a stronger government. It gives you a government that will not necessarily weigh every decision in the way that a PR government will, and therefore will make many worse decisions as a result.
Sarah, you're a comparativist, and so you've looked at this across countries. Would you like to sort of chip in on this?
So I don't sort of want to be the first past the post advocate on the panel, but there is, of course, a lot of political science research on this. And that's interesting, and it's not quite as clear. It was suggested that all the sort of indicators are necessarily pro-PR. But just sort of, if I'm going to play the devil's advocate, it's not necessarily, Germany has a quite efficient system of coalition formation, but if we look at the Netherlands, you can go over a year when you have the sort of the combination of a highly fragmented party system, which I think we probably would have in the UK, which indeed would give greater representation to a greater set of preferences. You also tend to have a rise of the radical far right, for example, which again is also a representation of voter preferences. But some people argue, instead we have these sort of big coalitions of parties. You were exactly right when you say the parties are very fragmented. So there is a sort of a trade-off between having a first past the post system, which does tend to give you governments single party majority governments that can govern, whether you like the way they do it or not is a different question, but that can govern and implement their manifesto, and where voters can see this is what we liked or we didn't like it, and they can punish them or reward them accordingly, versus a system where you tend to have much more consensual government, a much wider involvement spectrum of preferences represented both in Parliament, but also represented in the whole policy-making process. Not just, you can have minority governments, but where again those preferences are considered And so there's a sort of, I mean, maybe there's a sort of like cultural bias in certainly in England for this kind of very adversarial politics. So it's this guy versus that guy, or this woman versus that man, and that's what you get. You get these lines much clearer drawn up. So, I mean, you know, as you can hear from my accent, I'm obviously from the sort of PR side of things, and I like more parties, more things being, but I can see the argument. It's not clear cut that one is bad and brings only bad things. There is a sort of clear, yeah, I mean, you're a politician, but I would say as an...
Well, I think it's extremely clear cut. Yeah, we look at the majoritarian systems around the world, UK, Australia, US. I'd say those countries are a pretty powerful argument, the quality and the nature of their governments and the politics against first past the post.
And the thing that leads to is more division, and I think that's, you know, in a sense, you end up with, you get more extremes, and I think we're learning that is not good for people's confidence in politics, and you know, it becomes a much more angry, aggressive debate, which I don't think. Perhaps, sorry, you might help me, but in some of the PR systems, I don't think that is quite the case.
But certainly politics, the political outcomes would be more polarized because you can, as a single-party government, implement things without really a view to Parliament as a whole, where that's much harder when you have coalition politics. Of course, you will tend to, within Parliament and PR system, having more extreme parties, because you can have a party that's very extreme, getting 2% of the votes on sort of either end of the political spectrum. But the way government is formed tend to be more contention, and politics tends to be. So that's right. I mean, again, I don't know why sort of Anand is looking at me to be this sort of first past the post advocate. This is sort of just presenting some of these. I mean, another question which was raised also by Tim is what's the pathway to this? I guess the pathway would be, I can see the only pathway would be that Labour doesn't win a majority.
Minority, yeah.
Is a minority and has to rely on Liberal Democrats, maybe SNP, and says, okay, that's, you know, you get the Indie Ref, Lib Dems get PR. And that, I mean, that's the only way, isn't it? Because, of course, as soon as when you have a single party majority, you know, whether you're Labour Conservative, you're going to think, yeah, this is great for us, because basically you get many more seats than you otherwise would. So there's just no incentive. And again, there's a big literature on showing exactly that. The problem with electoral reform is the ones who tend to take the decisions are the ones who have benefited from exactly the system in place, whereas, you know, all us on this panel who don't, except the SNP, who don't benefit from the system, who are advocating it. So that's the tricky bit.
Well, Anand and I did this poll of MPs a few months ago, and we polled Labour MPs, and they're split pretty much 50-50 on PR, even though, you know, most of the affiliates that relate to the Labour Party and trade unions are increasingly supportive of proportional representation. As Sarah says, the MPs themselves value this sort of constituency link and think that first past the post is a good thing. So once it all enters the realm of parliamentary arithmetic after an election and a potential minority government, then, as Ed Miliband found in 2011, the Labour Party machinery isn't necessarily going to be inclined to support the views of everyone else on this panel. So that's plenty of problem.
They're also wrong about the constituency link thing. I've been elected under STV for 8 years from 2007, and you know I absolutely had a link with the area that I represented because there was 3 of us representing the area, and you can have a link with that entire area. So the constituency link was still there, probably in the way that it's not. In I'm less in favour of the additional members list system that we have in the Scottish Parliament, but under an STV system, you absolutely have that link. It's just a bigger area, but I get why, it's people who are very keen to keep their little empire that they've got and therefore don't want to have a new system come in.
It's very neutrally put. I mean, we're getting a lot of comments in about the fact that actually what we have is a one-party system, given, you know, that one party seems to win a lot more than the other. So I wonder...
This is the point, and at some point the electoral will say, I don't want to live in a one-party state. Something's got to change. It's the pathway to that and the timetable. And the thing about, I mean, I believe in free markets, sensibly regulated, but actually, of course, if you've got PR, it's actually more competitive. You've got more parties competing for votes that people can believe their vote matters. So actually, it encourages competition, it encourages new idea, and I think that's a good thing. It's the timetable to get there, but I'm certain at some point we get there. People don't want to live in a one-party state.
was almost pausing to wait for Natalie to say I agree with Richard.
Well, no, just to be different, I'm going to say that I think we have to be careful to acknowledge that the voting system is far from our only problem. We have entirely broken politics. And, I'm speaking to you, metaphorically speaking, from the House of Lords, created by a mixture of medieval-style inheritance and 18th century-style patronage. And yet that is actually more representative of the country than is the Commons. Because the crossbenchers, the non-party people, actually have the balance of power in the House of Lords. Now, that's just a sign of how broken our system is. And is that surprising? Because this is something that's been created by centuries of historical accident. The last significant change in Westminster was women getting the vote. Nothing within Westminster has significantly changed since then. There's things like the Remembrancer, the representative of the City of London, who has a special place in our Parliament because of an historical accident in the 18th century. That's why we actually have to look at the whole package and say, how do we want to be governed? And that's why I believe a People's Constitutional Convention to start off. And I will agree with Richard that people don't open the door and they say, look at you and say, we want PR or we want a People's Constitutional Convention. But they will very much say, our politics is broken and I'm totally fed up. And so our job as politicians is to give them the answers, to say, you're absolutely right, and this is how we're going to fix it.
I mean, it's a good line, Natalie, but it's a very narrow view of representativeness you've just taken, isn't it?
Well, the crossbenchers are, very outstanding people in their fields. Lord Bird, founder of The Big Issue, Sir Simon Woolley, founder of Operation Black Vote, Deborah Bull, ballet dancer and now advocate for they're very good people to represent the country. And they're the ones who have the balance of power on the Lords.
Sorry, something I was really intrigued by that Richard said, and this might be something that we can almost certainly, that Natalie and Richard will disagree on, was the stuff you were saying about net zero, and then we were talking about the single party state and so on. Are you going to sort of make the point, I don't know, that the policy of net zero is part of this sort of consensus that is this one party state, that you're going to sort of make the anti-politics case for why net zero is that going to be part of your reason why or the sort of your pitch against a net zero going forward?
No, I think they're separate issues. There's no question that the whole of Westminster believes in one route on that. But no, I think they're separate issues. It's just about, how are people going to afford to pay the bills? What are the reasons for these huge cost increases? And in a sense, it's hard for small parties to get noticed. So you need a drive. What do they stand for? And in a sense, the small parties that succeed, people know exactly what they stand for. And, in a sense, people know what the Green Party stands for, and so on. So I think that's where this goes.
Could I just disagree, first of all? Why have we got these huge increases? We've got these huge increases because we're reliant on fossil fuels, particularly gas. And I'll disagree with Alan that we haven't got a policy of net zero. We have a rhetoric of net zero. And if you look at the Carbon Brief did an analysis, and yes, government announcements add up to net zero by 2050. Government policies don't get you anywhere near it. And there isn't a consensus across Westminster because we want net zero by 2030.
But does it make your life harder that everyone is talking about the climate crisis? I mean, you might quite rightly or wrongly be saying they don't mean what they're saying, but it squeezes you, doesn't it?
No, it's great because it means we've won the argument. And it means they're talking about our issue. And I can sometimes see it in the eyes of some of those government ministers. They really hate it, but they're forced to at least mouth these words.
Now, Richard, if I just sort of turn to you on a specific thing, there's a diagram in this report that is quite worrying, I think, from your perspective, which is the number of people who simply don't know what the party stands for. I was intrigued the other evening that Nigel Farage was saying that this isn't what we voted for in terms of immigration numbers into the UK now, saying that actually this wasn't just about a points-based system, this was about reducing numbers. Is that where your party stands?
Look, I think our position is clear. We welcome smart, lawful immigration. And I think that is a positive, but we want to do it in a way that works for the country, works for our economy and works for our skill shortages. But I think in terms of where the voters are at, again, on the doorstep at the moment, that's not what people are talking about. People are talking about the cost of living, how they can afford their bills, inflation, tax rises. These are the big issues, and I think those will be the big issues of the next election. And yeah, at the end of the day, it is about being recognised for what you stand for. And it was a very good diagram, and I'm very conscious of it. I think, in a sense, we think the next election will be mid-24. I don't think it'll run to the end of 24. And what we're working out at the moment is what we think will be the big issues of the day. I'm telling you, I think the big issues of the day will be the cost of energy and the state of our healthcare system. Depending on what happens in that intervening period, is which one of those two things is the biggest issue.
Okay, but just to pin you down on this, is it a numbers issue with immigration? Is it about limiting it to certain numbers, or is it not anymore?
It's about doing it in a smart, lawful way that works for our economy. And that will depend on what are the skill shortages of the year, depending on whether you're in a growth phase, whether you're in a static phase, or whether you're in a recessionary phase. I think you should be flexible on it. And of course, in a sense, that's one of the joys of Brexit, is that you can be flexible. You can make these changes depending on the needs of the country, the needs of individual skill sectors, skill shortages or surpluses, and the needs of particular industry sectors.
But would you agree with Nigel Farage that there are too many non-Europeans coming in at the moment, and this wasn't what Leave voters wanted?
I think what people wanted was to be in control of the situation. And I think we've got a degree of control back, but it's not about, it's about what are the skill shortages, what do we need, and where's the growth coming from in terms of higher wages for British workers. And we're beginning to see that, but there are skill shortages, and we recognise that, and we should respond accordingly. But the best way to respond that is to train our own people, to train our young people straight out of school, straight out of colleges, out of universities. We need to train up many more of our own nurses, our own doctors, our own surgeons.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in on the immigration issue. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about...
If you have every single person in Scotland that comes out of school or university going into care, right, every single Scottish-born person doing that, you still don't have enough care workers. Right? Even if everybody that leaves school goes into that area, you don't have enough care workers in Scotland because of the way that our population is ageing. So, and that's without taking into account of all the other jobs we clearly need done. So the immigration thing is an issue. And, Richard's talking just now, and I still don't get what he thinks was wrong with the previous system. If, the issue is that he wants a lawful immigration system that's filling skill shortages. Well, we had a lawful immigration system that was filling skills shortages. That was working. Skill shortages were being
The key difference is
filled.
control. It was uncontrolled, and what it did actually was that the lowest paid, the least well off in society, they didn't see any wage growth for at least a decade, whereas in the 1990s, you saw real wage growth in the UK of 2.8% per annum. So people felt a lot poorer. That's the issue. So the joy of having control is you can then say, right, let's welcome it in the areas where we need it. And those are different ski shortages.
But that wasn't because of the immigration that was happening.
That was because of the
consistent Tory government.
It was freedom of movement. Absolutely, no doubt about it.
I want to come back to a phrase that you use. We have to get people in to serve the economy. What's the economy actually for? Do we all live our lives to serve the economy? Or do we actually want an economy that caters to people's needs and gives them a decent life and welcomes the refugees who our systems have created increasingly, and that looks after people? And as Kirsty was saying, we have a minimum wage. Set the minimum wage at the real living wage standard. We need social housing. Build social housing, genuinely affordable housing. We need a new hospital or a new school. Build those schools. Build those hospitals. And those are all government decisions. They have nothing to do with immigration.
And the way to get a decent wage and the way to get higher wages is to get higher growth in the economy. That will drive higher wages.
Immigration
for British
increases
workers.
growth in the economy. Immigration reduces public sector net debt. I mean, those are verifiable, demonstrable. If you look at the Treasury's Red Book that comes out, it decreases public sector net debt.
The evidence completely shows the opposite. Net debt increased. Net debt increased between 2004 and 2015 when we had freedom of movement. So it proves exactly the opposite.
I'm getting an overpowering sense of déjà vu with this debate. But
All right, okay, can I take you?
Can I just quickly turn to Alan and just, you mentioned that the Lib Dems were possibly going to favour rejoining the single market.
Yeah.
Is that politically something that's fraught with danger for them, do you think?
I don't think necessarily that would be. I mean, I think rejoining the European Union, I think they're sort of burnt from the policy of revoke in the last general election. I think they would be concerned were a party to explicitly talk about rejoining and therefore sort of outflank them on the Brexit issue. But I don't think necessarily a policy of single market and customs union membership, which was always, the most popular of the choices of Brexit in terms of, if you ask, sort of a plurality of people would have supported it. I think in reality, I think that would be a pretty sustainable electoral position that wouldn't really get in the way of their sort of broader electoral strategy, I wouldn't think. But
and Sarah, on the specific immigration question, where are the British people now?
One of the interesting things that have happened since Brexit, which is exactly what Richard also pointed out that he sees on the doorstep, is that immigration has become a lot less salient. I mean, it was very salient in the Brexit debate. It was one of the drivers of the Leave vote, whether it's reducing immigration or controlling it, as Richard was saying, and it's just become less salient. Some of that might have to do with the fact that people now feel a greater sense of control, but it is just not as important. That said, of course, it's not that there's a massive enthusiasm if you ask people for sort of an increase in immigration, but it's less up there as a concern for voters than it was pre-Brexit. In terms of the sort of what kind of immigration people want. If you ask very specifically about would you want immigration, for example, to deal with the health, social care crisis, then people are much more positive than if you ask more generally just about do you want sort of, let's say, unskilled immigration, if you ask like that. If you ask more specifically about immigration into the NHS or to fix certain what, Richard would call sort of skills shortages, people are more positive. But it certainly has become less of it was for many years one of the key concerns for people if you ask what is the most important issue or problem. Now it varies a bit across voter groups, but it's not surprisingly health, given that we're in a global pandemic, and the economy, and Brexit less so, and still for certain groups, particularly conservative voters, immigration is still up there, maybe in the sort of top 5, but nowhere where it was. But that doesn't mean that the British public is sort of turned into, let's just open the doors. But there is a realization that certain sectors, it's an issue that there are perhaps not enough labour.
We had generations of political leaders saying your life is rubbish because of immigration. And so no wonder it was a really important issue for people. That was, the consistently view or put forward by the Conservative Party. And so they now can't do that because they are in control of immigration. So they don't have the ability to do that. So now they've got to find out some other way that it's not their fault that people's lives are crap. And I don't think they've quite managed to work that out yet.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I don't know, Natalie, Richard, or indeed Kirsty, if you want to come out with... I mean, remember, you're standing between the audience and lunch at this point.
All right, I'm going for the 1 minute slot. On the whole immigration point, a lot of this is so stuck in the past. We're in a world where birth rates are falling off a cliff, where populations all around the world are ageing fast. We've got so many crises that we're facing. We have to encourage, develop and ensure they're used well, the resources, skills, time and talents of every individual on this planet. And that means, yes, improving very much education and training and taking the great weight of student debt off our young people. But it also means welcoming the people who are sadly going to be forced to come here by the climate emergency, people who are forced to come here by the disastrous geopolitical situations we've created, welcoming them, giving them a place. But it also means ensuring that we try and change our policies around the world so no one is forced to move, because that's where we should be.
Richard?
I've just conclude. I think that people want solutions to tomorrow's challenges and solutions for how we get election. For example, why do we in this country, why do we accept any waiting lists? Why don't we have any politicians that have an ambition we want zero waiting lists? Most developed nations don't have long waiting lists, and yet we've been brainwashed to accept them. I think that's the sort of positive debate that we should be having amongst our politicians. And likewise, I think just the cost of one of our key human rights, the cost of energy, will again, I think, be one of the big debates, and people want positive solutions, and let's have that debate.
Go on.
Brexit has made stuff worse. Brexit has made things worse for an awful lot of people, for the vast majority of people. Going forward, all of us, whatever party we're in, whether we're in one of the two main parties or not, we're going to be dealing with the cost of living crisis. We're going to be dealing with the climate emergency. We're going to be dealing with supporting our constituents and our voters and people who live throughout the UK in that. There's not a lot of optimism right about now. It's not a positive picture, looking forward. So I'm sorry to kind of end towards that note, but things are not in a great place, and politicians are going to have to do an awful lot of work to try and make things better and to try and gain some of that trust back.
Okay.
Well,
I'm going to say,
Natalie,
let's finish
you've
on
already had some final remarks.
hopeful notes. Things are going to change, and that's good news. Got to finish in a hopeful way.
The even better news is the food here is generally really good. So on that note, let me thank Natalie, Kirsty, Sarah, Richard and Alan for a fascinating session. Thank you.